I'd like to introduce the forum a little bit. The theme of this inaugural event, promoting diversity and inclusion, could not be more timely or more relevant as we look at the world around us. The consequences of exclusion and discrimination are evident in the rising tide of populism, protectionism, and xenophobia that threatens our institutions and weakens our social fabric. Exclusion from the benefits of development or from the economic growth resulting from globalization has generated individual and collective alienation in many parts of our world and fosters a sense of injustice. Fear and distrust seem to be dominant sentiments of our times, and the damaging effects of social marginalization and discrimination are seen in rising levels of intolerance and extremism around the world. Economic inequalities and dislocation resulting from the effects of climate change will only make things worse. In the face of these realities, it would be easy to succumb to hopelessness and despair. We are here, however, to say that there is another way forward, a better way, a way that reflects the lessons of our past and that builds on Canadian values. It is this other way that we're here to discuss at the Victoria Forum as we develop ideas for a better world. The threads that are unraveling in our 21st century tapestry are those of trust, empathy, and mutual respect. They're being replaced by prejudice, short-term thinking, and narrowly defined self-interest. We're not immune from these ills in Canada and have our own troubled past. We can, however, learn from our history and see that we have prospered as a nation when we have embraced diversity, when we have opened our economy to trade, to migration, to foreign investment. It is to explore these lessons and rework the threads in our tapestry that we have come together here at this inaugural Victoria Forum. Je suis content de vous voir en si grand nombre mobilisés autour de la question de la diversité et de l'inclusion. The agenda of the forum is broad, and our aspirations are high. Over the next 3 days, we will consider 6 themes: diversity and economic prosperity, the economics of Indigenous inclusiveness, the geopolitics of diversity, defining climate justice, private philanthropy, civil society and inclusive development, and global trade and the economics of diversity. These are the big questions facing our age, and we've brought together an amazing group of speakers, participants, and partner organizations to help solve them. Le Forum de Victoria est une belle collaboration entre de nombreux partenaires, and I'm grateful for the support and participation from Philanthropic Associations Canada, the World Wildlife Fund Canada, the Canadian International Council, Haida Enterprise Corporation, HICO, the Global Centre for Pluralism, the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation, and the Conference Board of Canada. I'm also grateful to our sponsors who are supporting this event in a very meaningful way, and would like to thank the University of Victoria and the Gustafson School of Business, as well as TELUS, Vancity, and Pratt & Whitney Canada for the generous financial support. I would also like to thank our media sponsors, the Times Colonist and Corporate Knights, as well as our event and travel sponsors, the Victoria Conference Centre and Flight Centre. Finally, I would like to acknowledge my 2 associate co-chairs who have played the major role in making this event happen. Dr. Adele Gitouni, my colleague at UVic, and Ms. Sebastian Beaulieu from Global Affairs. Thank you. And now, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to introduce our opening panel, which will set the stage for the rest of this weekend. It is entitled, Canada at 150, Mindful of Our Past for a Better Future. Our distinguished panelists require very little introduction, and I know how much you're looking forward to hearing from them. They are Assembly of First Nations National Chief, Perry Bellegarde. National Chief Bellegarde is from the Little Black Bear Nation, Treaty 4 territory. He served as Chief of the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations and Saskatchewan Regional Chief for the Assembly of First Nations. He has also served as the Tribal Chair of the Touchwood File Hills Campbell Tribal Council and Councillor for and Chief of Little Black Bear First Nation. Perry Bellegarde was named AFN National Chief on December 10, 2014. Next, we have the Right Honourable Kim Campbell. Ms. Campbell is a woman of many firsts. From the age of 16, when she became the first female student body president of her high school, until 30 years later, as Canada's 19th and first female Prime Minister, Kim Campbell has spent much of her life breaking barriers for women. She served at all three levels of Canadian government, was our first female Justice Minister, as well as our first female Defence Minister. In fact, she was the first female Minister of Defence of any NATO country. Also on the panel, we have Ms. Roberta Jamieson. Roberta Jamison has carved out a distinguished career as a groundbreaker, leader, advocate, and thought leader, with a committed eye to social justice, conflict resolution, and above all, the rights and interests of First Nations and Indigenous peoples. Since 2004, Ms. Jamieson has been President and CEO of Indspire, an Indigenous-led national charity that has raised over $91 million and has increased ninefold annual disbursements of bursaries and scholarships, supporting Indigenous students' post-secondary education and training. She's former chief of the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory. Joining us by video link, the Right Honourable Paul Martin. Mr. Martin was Prime Minister of Canada from 2003 to 2006 and Minister of Finance from 1993 to 2002. Mr. Martin is well known for many things, including signing agreements with the provinces and territories to establish the first national early learning and childcare program and creating a new financial deal for Canada's municipalities. Under his leadership, the Canadian government reached an historic deal with Aboriginal peoples of Canada to eliminate the existing funding gaps in health, education, and housing, known as the Kelowna Accord. After leaving public life, Mr. Martin created the Capital for Aboriginal Prosperity and Entrepreneurship Fund, an investment fund investing in Indigenous business, and founded the Martin Family Initiative, focusing on the early childhood and elementary and secondary education of Indigenous children and youth. Their mission is to work alongside Indigenous experts, communities, and leaders to ensure that the educational opportunities from birth through to secondary school for Indigenous children are as good as any in the country and are culturally appropriate. And our panel will be moderated by Anna Maria Tremonti. Ms. Tremonti is an award-winning journalist and host of CBC Radio 1's The Current that burst onto the airwaves in November of 2002. She brings a mix of hard-edged journalism and hard-won empathy to a 90-minute program that tackles everything from the politics of the day to the changes that affect our society, to the stories of individuals whose personal journeys and traumas affect us all. She was host of the flagship investigative program, The Fifth Estate. She spent 9 years as a foreign correspondent covering conflict and political events around the world. She has won numerous awards, including the Adrienne Clarkson Diversity Award. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our opening panel.
There's Paul Martin. I don't know if he can see us. Hi, Paul. Hi, Paul.
Hello, everyone. Well, we are here to talk about life and opportunity, happiness and harmony, 15, 50, 100 years into the future. That's a very tall order for our panelists. To channel Donald Rumsfeld, we are going to talk about the many unknown unknowns. But the four panelists we have before us today already have experience confronting many known knowns and many unknown knowns. So for the next little while, we are going to draw on their experience and on their imaginations to help us think and to think differently about our futures. We're going to have a discussion lasting about an hour, and then we're going to open this to questions to those of you in the audience. There are microphones that are going to be available, and the only thing I would ask you is to keep your questions short and to the point so that we can keep moving forward. And at the end, we will hear some closing thoughts from each of our panelists. But we begin first with some initial thoughts from our panelists, and we begin that with Roberta Jamieson.
To go up there?
I think you can do it from right where you are if you want.
Okay. Mohawks like to stand up. Do you mind if I stand up?
I don't mind at all. We don't mind. Whatever you like.
I can't. And I'm short. Good evening. Sego, Scano, bonsoir. First, it is appropriate that I would acknowledge Marianne Thomas. Nyawagoa, thank you for bringing our minds together. And Chief Sam and Chief Thomas for your welcome to your traditional territory. I acknowledge your honor, I acknowledge the National Chief, I acknowledge all special guests, and I congratulate the sponsors, and I say how privileged I am to be part of this opening panel. I have decided not to take stock of the last 150 years. I will begin by acknowledging with tremendous respect and love the fact that 150 years into Confederation, First Peoples continue to be here, have survived, are resilient, are loving, and you saw it, open, compassionate, and willing to share. How remarkable. If we're going to learn in Canada from the past 150 years and create a healthy Canada for the future, it's going to take vision. It's going to take a lot of hard work. And it requires a reality check. I think that's what the next couple of days are about. Canada, we're a country that celebrate and take great pride in our diversity. Have we asked ourselves, do we use it? If you take one small corner, let's look at a small piece. There is a great organization that looks at corporate boards and diversity annually. They will tell you gender diversity on corporate boards has increased at a glacial pace, about 20%. Last time I looked, more than 50% of the population were women. Aboriginal people, we've gone backwards on corporate boards. We were 1.3% a year ago, we're now 0.6. If you look at the C-suite, if you look at senior executive ranks, if you look at senior government ranks, if you look anywhere, you will not see diversity in the country represented. So I think the first thing we need to guard against is believing our own press. Somebody once told me that, and what a wise thing it was. Nowhere are we going to need vision and hard work more than in our relationship with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. The only place we're overrepresented or well represented is in the jail or amongst the greatest numbers of children in care. If we're going to create, you'll find I'm a very frank, straightforward person. I think we need a reality check. If we're going to create a healthy relationship, which I hear more and more people saying, and I have to say, I'm more optimistic today than I have ever been, it's going to require skillful intervention from all sectors, from everyone represented in this room. It's going to require a long view. It's going to require some letting go of control. I've lived through multiculturalism, the cultural mosaic, and many, many policies. which has, and I think Chief Thomas was eloquent. The invitation has been, come on in, but leave yourself at the door. Leave your Indigenous identity at the door. So, I think we're going to have to develop a little better comfort with ambiguity because we're growing and developing relationships and partnerships. I'm asked to set the stage briefly, and I will do that. I think the biggest question is, do we want sustainable Indigenous communities in the future of Canada or not? If I were to arrive from outer space and ask that question today and look around me in the country, all indications are no. What would it mean to say yes? For Indigenous, I think it's a question of capacity. First of all, it means decent houses, water you can drink, decent health, all the things that Chief Thomas called our minds to. But let me break up the capacity into two pieces. One, for Indigenous people, it means capacity, yes. We have tremendous capacity in Indigenous knowledge, ways of knowing. We need to use it more and more. That means decolonization, full stop. We also need to grow and develop our leadership in all sectors, and that means education and training in traditional ways and in contemporary ways. And I'm in the business of education at Indspire, so I'm engaged in this. It means education, though, that validates identity, validates who we are, not asks us to be someone else. Our children do not lack confidence or self-esteem, they lack validation in broader society. It means leading. It means occupying the space. It means passing laws. It means contributing. It means taking that partnership seat at the table and shaping the future together, economically, culturally, and otherwise. And it cannot be done alone. We are at a place in our history where many of our cultures, our communities, are broken, and they need the support of lots of the rest of the country to support that development. Capacity. For non-Indigenous Canadians, it also is a question of capacity if we're going to build this relationship. One, we need to develop a greater understanding of our history, our shared history. Two, we need to have less reliance and default to stereotypes and myths. Three, we need greater comfort with ambiguity. Working with our people, we all want certainty, but we have very different ideas of certainty. And if we're going to shape the country together in partnership, there's some developmental and some ambiguity to be had. We also need a willingness to support serious and sustained investment in Indigenous communities. And it means sharing control. And here too, there is a role for everyone to play. Finally, let me say to you why it's worth doing. One, it's the right thing to do. And if we didn't know it, the Supreme Court keeps reminding us. Two, there's a strong economic case to be made for the doing it, over and over. Every year, I read a new report. If we close, the latest one tells us, if we close the gaps, more than 1/5 of the labor force growth in Canada in 2036 will come from Indigenous people. We can't have babies faster than anybody else. Lord knows we try, but we still have more. We'll also contribute more than $36 billion to Canada's GDP by 2031, and even more if there is a greater participation in resource and other development in the country. Finally, third, society will at long last benefit from the Indigenous knowledge that remains, from traditional health practices to science, to astrology, to conflict resolution, to treaty making. Seems to me the globe could benefit from learning from the treaty making and diplomacy that Indigenous people have always practiced. Those are my opening thoughts as we start to craft the future of the country together.
I'm going to ask the Right Honourable Paul Martin on video. Hello, Mr. Martin.
Hello, how are you?
To give us his next comments.
Well, the first thing I want to do is I really want to say just how sorry I am that I'm not with you. The Forum's program simply looks terrific. And I must say those chairs look very comfortable. I want to make anybody a suggestion. If you really want to know how difficult it is to make a speech, I can say something and I hear myself coming back at you. I must say, I don't think I like what I'm saying. In any event, our panel, as I understand it, was asked to talk about how to use the past to build a better future. In that context, according to Stats Canada, for the first time in the history of Canada, there are more people over the age of 65 than there are under the age of 15. This is one more reason why Canada's failure to provide the supports that are required by Indigenous children, who are the youngest and fastest growing segment of our aging population, makes no sense. I'm going to pick up a great deal in what Roberta has just said. As we all know, we underfund their education, we underfund their health care, we underfund their welfare, and we provide them with undrinkable water. What we don't talk about, however, is that all too often, the current system sets up Indigenous babies for failure before they're even born. And it's simply not acceptable, as Roberta just said, that sooner or later, almost 50% of children, Indigenous children, who find themselves in foster homes are Indigenous. And the reason for this can be as simple and as unfair as their mother's poverty, which goes against every value we as Canadians stand for. So the question is, what do we do about it? As Cindy Blackstock has said, we must do whatever it takes to ensure that future generations of Indigenous Canadians do not have to spend their lives recovering from their childhood. And therein lie the questions that we have to ask and what we have to answer. How do we break this cycle? How do we help fulfill a child's dream? How do we better support Indigenous families? The answers are out there, and they all start with a real partnership, I believe, between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canada. Now, to this end, some of us have developed a new program, one that trains home visitors who are mothers from the community who've already raised their children, but are ready to walk the path again with expecting moms from the moment of the younger mother's pregnancy. As well, these visitors will knock on the door, they will meet with the expecting mother, they will stay with her all through the 9 months of pregnancy, and then for 2 more years. In fact, for 4 full years, they will interact with her. And as well, the new and expecting moms, we would hope, would participate in weekly talking circles. And later on, their children will be encouraged to take part in early learning, with the home visiting component, as I just mentioned, continuing through the piece. What we hope is that this program will provide a strong platform on which families can raise their children, but also on which communities can build further initiatives. A platform that puts children at the center of the community, meeting whatever the community's needs, whatever those children's needs are, whatever the family's needs are, and also giving community services the chance to work as closely together as is possible. By better resourcing and supporting new moms and their families, clearly we hope to see an improvement in early childhood development. But we also hope to prevent the unacceptable number of child welfare apprehensions. Just think about how many times we've sat down with friends who have succeeded, friends who have done well, but who are Indigenous. And sooner or later, at one point, they begin to talk about their own childhood and what it was like for them to have overcome what they had to overcome. And ask yourself if there isn't something fundamentally wrong with a rich society like Canada's that cannot afford to, in fact, help Indigenous families make the kind of success that we know that they can make. Boy, I would like to be at your meeting tomorrow when you're talking about how the economy can handle this. This is a program that we intend to introduce in partnership with an interested community very soon. But let me just close by saying the idea of working with the community, working with families, is not ours. As an elder said when we first approached her, we knew this. We did this. We have this knowledge. Our traditional way is that the family and the community raises the child. That knowledge was taken away from us by the residential schools. What that elder was saying was Indigenous communities know what is best for their children's well-being, but they must have the support required to reestablish their traditions. It's a lot more expensive to build up. Yes, it is, than it is to prevent it. But the fact is that cost has got to be borne because the responsibility is ours. This is the one way I would suggest, as the forum asks, that we look to the past to build the future. Thank you.
I'll ask the Right Honourable Campbell to speak now.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Right Honourable Paul Martin. I don't know what my family calls me, the Right Honey. I don't know what your family calls you, but it's an honor to bear the title, and it's an honor to be sharing the panel with you. This question of looking back to understand the future is a very important one. Probably the most unrewarding or unsuccessful job anybody can have is to be a futurologist, because people are always predicting the future, and then 10, 15, 20 years later, we look at what they predicted, and it's not what came true at all. But Anne Bernice's poem, fabulous poem, I think raised one of the key questions. How will we be viewed 150, 150 years from now? How will people look back on us today? Will we have met the challenges that we needed to meet? Will we have put in place things that needed to be put in place? About 10 years ago, a British journalist named Anatole Lieven wrote a very powerful column about climate change, in which he said, if the democratic governments of our time cannot address this issue, not only will the future of the planet be very much imperiled, the future of human life, but there will be no credibility for democracy among those in future generations if we fail this test. If those of us in this society who fought to create democratic institutions, if we cannot meet that challenge. And so when we look backward to understand forward, I think one of the things we have to think about in thinking about diversity is how diverse, how sensitive is our view of what our history really is. When we think today about diversity, we say whose voices are not at the table. When we look at our history, we say whose voices, whose lives, whose realities are not part of our history. And in order to move forward with a diverse and inclusive society, we have to be inclusive in our history. And that's why Her Honour's comments about her celebration on November the 8th were so important. Because there are many, Virginia Woolf, the author, Virginia Woolf once said, anonymous is a woman. That idiot at Google who wrote the paper and was rightfully fired for it, talking about that women were not really suited to tech, when we know, if you know your history, that technology, the whole area of computers, many of its most important founders were women. No, you don't read their names all the time because they are non-prototypical. People don't expect them to be there, but they have been there. And we are growing to make a more inclusive history that includes those people, those women who made those contributions. When we talk about those who fought for our society, the story of our Aboriginal veterans is shocking. It is a shame on Canada. Because one of the tests we often say is, oh, well, so-and-so fought for our country. You know, we were at war together. We fought for democracy. But many of the people who put their lives on the line are not recognized. The BBC recently had a very interesting program called I Thought Remembrance Day Was a White Celebration. How many of us know the role that the Indian Army played in helping our allies to be victorious in World War II? 2.5 million people from the subcontinent of India, of whom I think about 800,000 were Muslims. We don't know that history. We don't celebrate that history. So those people are invisible. We don't accord them the value of being part of our history. Her Honor talked about the Chinese veterans. My father was very active in veterans organizations. My sister's here today, and we are the daughters of 2 war veterans. Our mother was in the Canadian Navy, she was a Wren, and our dad was in the Army and fought in Italy where he was wounded. And he became very committed to veterans issues as he got older. And one of his great relationships was with the Chinese veterans in Vancouver. And he actually went to China with them. And he very much felt that their role had been overlooked, and they had done amazing things because being Asian, they were often able to do very dangerous missions fighting against the Japanese because racially they could blend in, etc. And my father often talked about, you know, on one visit to China, when a Chinese general looked at him and said, you know, you don't look Chinese. And my father said, well, I've been in Canada a long time. But the point is, to be inclusive in our future requires us to be inclusive in our history. And one of the things that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has done has forced us to confront part of our history that most of us are either ignorant about or don't want to know about. And for those of us who wonder why there is so much social dysfunction in First Nations communities, we understand when a government's policy has been to take the Indian out of the child, to break those generational connections that all of us who knew our grandparents and loved to hear the stories that they would tell us. You know, 3 of my grandparents were born in Scotland. I have no sense of being Scottish, but I know my history, I know my roots, and I am comfortable with that. And I can identify as much as I want. So it is very important for us to give place to all of those who are part of our history, to redefine who we are as a society and who we must be as we move forward together. I came back, I was out of Canada for many years, and in 2014 I came back to be the founding principal of the Peter Lougheed Leadership College at the University of Alberta. And it's been a great program. I'm actually interested in passing on the baton now because I have a long-suffering husband who'd like to see more of me. But it's been very exciting because we try to answer the question, what do leaders need to know? We need to know ourselves. There's a growing body of research in psychology that tells us how we think and implicit attitudes and all the ways that we get in the way of making good decisions. But we also know the research about how important diversity is in terms of making good decisions, in terms of avoiding some of the cognitive biases that get in that set us up for error. And so one of the things we do with our students in the first semester, they do a full-day Aboriginal workshop where they talk about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They do the blanket exercise, which is very uncomfortable. The pedagogy of discomfort is part of this, because we say, what do leaders need to know? These are young people who have to lead in Canada. So we have to take advantage of the painful exercise that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was, to learn those lessons, to confront that pain, to confront that experience. And just as we look back on Sir John A. Macdonald and we say he was a remarkable person, but he was a racist when it came to our First Nations. And many who worked with him were. And they made egregious errors. They made egregious decisions that we have to live with. What will people say 150 years about us? Will they say the leaders of the early 21st century learned the lessons of Canadian history and dealt with the issues that we need them to deal with? Or will they say they made egregious errors and now we are paying the price for those errors? And so I think that is something that we really have to think about. And when I was Prime Minister, I created the Department of Canadian Heritage because the federal government does not have the jurisdiction over education in this country. And I'd been through 2 unsuccessful attempts to amend the Constitution, and what had struck me was how little Canadians really know about their history and how different parts of Canada have different views of our history. And even then, I underestimated the extent to which we don't know. And we've just gone through a process to help us know even more. So as we look backward, let us say, who really was there? What really are the lessons of Canadian history that we have to learn? And how can we ensure that the process of creating our future is the most inclusive, the most respectful, and therefore the most effective that it possibly can be? Because those young people of Anne Bernice's poem, she herself, the grandchildren of the grandchildren, will be judging us. But hopefully they will be judging us with pride and not living under terrible, terrible burdens because we failed our historical mission.
Chief Bellegarde.
That was really good, Prime Minister. I like you now. That's good. No, I always like... Ista nenash komun nista kanaskom teno kakia no temtek no akomaganak. Ista ogimao Sam ogimao Thomas kanaskom tin kiteyak megagishimot no tawinans man semanto kanaskom tin. Prime Ministers and my friend, she's done so much leadership work. It's always good to listen to you all, And I always said in Cree to thank you all as relatives and friends. Ninaskamun, I'm happy to be here. And acknowledging you all as friends and relatives, and Roberta for her words as well at the podium. Thanking the chiefs for their words and welcome, and the elder for the prayer to get off in a good way here at this gathering. To the University of Victoria and all the organizers, thank you so much as well, and your honor always for being here and doing good things for all of us. And this very important topic of diversity and inclusiveness, learning from the past, charting a new future for all of us as First Nations people, and I'll say we're the two-leggeds. And I say that with great respect because I'm going to start off with this Indigenous worldview and close off with that. Because for us as First Nations people, and I'm going to say this very quickly because it takes a lot of time, but when I say all my relatives, I'm not only greeting us as the two-leggeds, because we don't see black, white, yellow, or red as First Nations people. We don't see color when you go to ceremony, but we're the two-legged tribe. And in our worldview, we acknowledge the Creator. We acknowledge the one that sits in the east, the south, the west, the north. We acknowledge Mother Earth, where everything comes from. Father Sky, Grandmother Moon, Grandfather Sun. We'll acknowledge the male plants, the female plants. We'll acknowledge our relatives, the four-legged ones, the ones that fly, the ones that swim, the ones that crawl. We're all part of that as a family. We'll also acknowledge the four grandmothers that look after the water, the rainwater, the fresh water, the salt water, and then the power of women when life comes. So when we greet people and we say, it's not just us here that we're acknowledging, but everything I just described. Now keep that in your mind when we start talking about inclusivity and diversity for the future. So for us now in Canada as Indigenous peoples, there's some statistics and some numbers we have to look at. And across Canada, there's 634 First Nations. But we have over 60 different nations or tribes, different languages. And that's something people need to get. People always talk about New Zealand as a model. Well, there's only Maori people down there. One Indigenous tribe. We got 60 plus up here in Canada. And we're all distinct and unique as First Nations people. And so we're about 4.5% of Canada's population, 1.5 million people. Look at the statistics. Half live in our communities, half live off. So that's an issue to look after. Think about how I use this number, 6 versus 63rd. According to the United Nations Human Development Index, Canada is rated up 6th quality of life. But you apply the same indices to Indigenous peoples, First Nations peoples, we're 63rd. So it's 6 versus 63rd. Something that we need to close is this gap. Because this gap represents everything we talk about in Canada every day. The 1,200 missing murdered Indigenous women and girls, 40,000 First Nations kids in Aboriginal foster care, 60 to 80% of the jails filled by our people, overcrowded housing, 133 boil water advisories, high youth suicide rate. All this 6 versus 63rd gap is what we need to collectively close together. And you need to embrace diversity and inclusivity if we're going to bring this gap closed. So we're not even at the starting line as First Nations people. And so from the past, yes, residential schools is genocide. Yes, Indian Act was colonization and control. And we still have the Indian Act from 1876 to 2017. And so the residential schools, we see the intergenerational trauma. We see all these things, family breakup, self-identity gone, the whole thing, because those two things. So we learn. So embracing things now moving forward. Embracing that we have different nations and languages in Canada. Even embracing this thing now, and we talked over lunch with you, Vic, in the law program, Indigenous law, how in Canada now you have common law and civil law. First Nations law, Indigenous law is emerging. It's there. There should be enough space and growth in Canada for Indigenous law. First Nations jurisdiction. First Nations self-determination, self-government to as well occupy the space and occupy the field. You have federal government, provincial governments, you have First Nation governments. And so respecting those things. We have treaties that we want to be honored and implemented according to the spirit and intent. Because under the treaty relationship, it was peaceful coexistence and mutual respect. But we don't see that. And we're to mutually benefit from the land and resources of this great country called Canada. But we don't see that. 6 versus 63rd. So we've been excluded. So embracing, and yes, getting more of our Indigenous peoples around decision-making tables is a key thing. Boards of directors, public sector, private sector, university board of directors, First Nations people on the Supreme Court of Canada. Ooh, good one. Wherever decisions are being made, wherever policies are being decided on, wherever legislation is being developed that impacts on us as Indigenous peoples, but as a country, you're going to get better decisions by getting us around those decision-making tables. No question, both in the public sector and the private sector. And then you can break it down locally, regionally, nationally, internationally. So what do we want to get done? What are we trying to get done? Locally, regionally, nationally, and internationally. You can do things with the federal government, no question. That's one strategy over there. And we're doing things. Missing murdered Indigenous women and girls, trying to implement all the TRC calls to action, looking at a new fiscal relationship with the Crown, because we've had a 2% funding cap for 20 years, but why not link it in to a percentage of GDP? Because how do you build this great economy in Canada? It's a percentage from the land and resource wealth. Well, where did that come from in the first place? Peaceful coexistence and mutual respect, mutually benefiting from sharing the land and the resources. So if we talk about a new fiscal relationship with the Crown, why not link it to a percentage of GDP that's been generated? Why not look at it like that? That's outside the box. So investments in education, K-12, post-secondary, very important. Walk in both worlds, not just K-12, not just your doctorates and your masters on one hand. Equally important is the other one. And this one is your languages, your ceremonies, your customs, your traditions about who you are as a First Nations person. Our old people used to always say, you walk in both worlds here, Nosum, grandson. You need 2 systems of education now to exist. That's what they're talking about, 2 systems. So things going on federally, Then you can do things provincially. Change your curriculums. Teach about residential schools, the Indian Act. You know, we can teach about those all. And why not embrace our languages as original languages as well, of the territories? Things can happen like that. So locally, regionally, nationally, internationally. The UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is the roadmap to reconciliation. That's got to be embraced. That has to be accepted. And does it fit into Section 35 of Canada's Constitution, which recognizes existing Aboriginal treaty rights? Well, it's an international document, but we say it's a full box of rights. And in Section 35, the most important right is the right to self-determination. The inherent right to self-determination. And if people can embrace that we're nations within a nation, that there's separate jurisdiction, getting outside the Indian Act, moving beyond the Indian Act, exerting our own laws, our own sovereignty, our own jurisdiction, that's a roadmap. But with that principle of peaceful coexistence and mutual respect. That's always there. And in this worldview that I started off with, how we're all related, we're all part of this family, because the biggest thing that we're going to challenge for the future is what are we leaving our children, those great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren, go down 7 generations. Because the land and the water are so important. What are we leaving for those ones? That's why that environment and that worldview is important to bring to light at all policy and legislative makers, regionally, nationally, internationally, to incorporate that worldview. Because then there will be something left for the future. That's how we see it. And if we embrace that, then we can all start singing what a wonderful world it would be. And that's my opening comments.
So let's roll up our sleeves on how we get there. You are each underlining the importance of building a foundation for future generations. The care and education of children so that future generations can be empowered thinkers and doers. The understanding of the past in order to see the future. We see the limits and challenges to all governments in that process today, budgets, austerity, all of that kind of thing. Are there new ways to think about working with civil society, business, philanthropy, and government to make more of an impact in talking about the change you are all underlining here today? Perry Bellegarde, I'm going to start with you.
Well, again, on that one, you know, we can look at the federal government and what can happen there. As Assembly of First Nations, we're an advocate organization. So we try to influence what the Sunia Ogimau comes up with every year. That's the big money chief. That's the finance minister. It's the federal budget. What goes into that federal budget? Because if we don't influence that federal budget, you're not going to see investments in each of these ministries. And if these ministries don't get it, it doesn't flow out to our communities. And so that's where that $8.4 billion comes from last couple of years, $3.4 billion. But you're not going to close this gap in one fiscal year. You need long-term sustainable investments. And that has to happen. And I'll need all Canadian people to get that. But then I also need another thing to happen, is the bureaucracy has to change. The bureaucrats, the deputy ministers, Privy Council, because you've got all this great vision being said by the Prime Minister and the Liberal cabinet, right? Nation to nation and reconciliation and all these good things. But if it doesn't happen over here with the deputy minister and all the different ministries, and they still do things the same old way, you're not going to get those resources out to the First Nations in a very effective, efficient manner to have results on the ground. So that's federally. Provincially, the same thing can happen. You know, like in terms of policies for resource revenue sharing. So I break it down locally, regionally, nationally, you know, and then sometimes even internationally. But provincial governments, we can't forget, have a big role to play.
But are there others you can bring into that mix and that you have to bring into that mix as you move forward?
Yes.
That aren't in the mix right now?
No, we need to bring and build allies with civil society, with all the big city mayors, with all the like to get behind these concepts we're talking about, so that governments hear it, so they're not opposed. So it's not just Chief Bellegarde saying this, but all Canadians are saying it because they get it, and the politicians are going to listen because they're going to then they're going to support resource revenue sharing agreements. They're going to support great investments in education and training and remove the cap on post-secondary. So we have to build allies. So the answer is yes. We have to do that, and we have to do a more effective job of building partnerships.
Kim Campbell, what do you think?
Well, you know, it's interesting. I often, when I'm speaking to people about government, I make the point about how significant local governments are. It's a great place to develop your political reflexes because you're nose to nose with the people who are affected by what you do. You don't go off someplace else. But it's also a very kind of nimble and responsive level of government, it can be. And it's interesting, if I look at Edmonton, where I'm spending a lot of time, or Winnipeg, both of which have large Indigenous communities, the mayors in those cities are very responsive and very eager to try and engage with the challenges of their First Nations communities. But you know, it's a kind of an interesting mosaic or jigsaw puzzle, because on the one hand, the law, and this is why I am passionate about the rule of law and democracy, many of the advances that First Nations have made over the last few decades have been through the courts. Through the Supreme Court of Canada, clarifying the provisions of the Constitution and the Charter. And when that happens, people have to sit up and take notice. And so the private sector and civil society, all of these people, they're living in a reality where if you want to do business, you have to respect the rights of the First Nations who have rights over a particular property or particular resource. But the other thing that's been part of that too is the growing just daily recognition in a kind of a ritualistic sense of the cohabitation that we have, that we live on land in British Columbia, perhaps unceded land, in the prairie provinces, Treaty 6 land, Treaty 7 land, whatever. And it's interesting because I was in Ottawa a couple of weeks ago participating in a symposium at the Supreme Court of Canada, yet another Canada 150 celebration, spending the whole day talking about the court. And somebody raised the point whether, when the Supreme Court of Canada sits, the Chief Justice should say we are sitting here today on Treaty 1 land. And should this be something that they say? And my view was, why not? You've got the coat of arms of Canada above the bench. Treaty 1 it's already Treaty 1. When we say these things, we raise the level of awareness of people of this historical reality. And the Chief Justice of Nova Scotia stood up at this meeting and said, I didn't know much about Aboriginal issues. And of course, there are less fractures, and they're different in the Maritimes than they are out here in British Columbia, where I think it's more complex, and because we didn't have treaties. But he said, I became aware that a great wrong had been done. And he was quite passionate about this and wanted very much for people to understand. But it's very hard. And the point I made was, you know, reconciliation is harder than it seems in this sense, that oxen will be gored. You know, people want certain interests, and they're going to find that the courts have recognized that First Nations have control over some of these interests. So it's a challenge. I mean, it's not going to be easy. Mm-hmm. But it gets better if we raise our children to understand that history, that agreements were entered into, that you know, we didn't sort of conquer the First Nations people and sort of send them off, that this was, in fact, a very different kind of relationship between the settlers who came from European countries and our First Nations people. So as people come to understand that more, even if it's through the ritual saying, you know, we're pleased to be here today on Treaty 6 land and blah, 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 of the you know, different people, as they say in Edmonton or here in British Columbia. It creates a kind of an awareness so that throughout society, people come to understand these are interests that have to be reconciled. These are rights that have to be respected. But these are also, therefore, opportunities to be seized, that there are possibilities here in this relationship, that it's no longer, as I say, we make the people in our history visible. We say, hey, remember these people we've been ignoring, you know, and you know, thinking we're, you know, there are just some problems we don't do them. Well, here's where they fit in our history, and here is the legal relationship that we've had with them through the Crown and through our treaties. We now have to make this part of our lives. So there is a kind of a mosaic of legal developments, social response to that, and the kind of imagination and care that you find in civil society, and the savvy of business people and, you know, people concerned with economic development to try and take opportunity and create partnerships to make it possible for things to happen in mutual benefit. So I see it as something that when you ask the question, are there other players? I think other players are coming into the field. And it's interesting that we had a speaker at our college, actually, I don't know if you know Michelle Wilsden from Edmonton, but she talked about also one of the problems of making agreements as a First Nation, making agreements with the provincial or the local governments, is that people are worried that this has a risk of extinction of their rights, since the rights are with the federal crown. And so there's a lot of resistance among First Nations people about having those relationships, and maybe it simply requires the building of trust and the understanding and the reassurance and the establishment of the fact that this does not extinguish your rights to deal with other levels of government. But there are, you know, the history of the relationship of First Nations people and governments. You know, it's not a happy one, so you can be, you're not surprised that people are a bit suspicious. But these are all things that I think are in flux. Things are happening.
Well, and so let me ask Paul Martin. The relationships with government are not moving at the pace that many would want them to move. Are there different ways to introduce business, philanthropy, civil society with government to accelerate this pace as we move toward the future? Everything else in our future is moving really fast. Is there a way to do that, Paul Martin?
Well, yeah, obviously there are, and I think that I actually think that the split with INAC is going to help that a great deal. But let me, and I'm quite happy to go into your question in terms of how do you set up better partnerships and how do you make that work. But I think that in asking that question, you're also letting government off the hook. And I just like to put a couple of facts on the table. Single most important thing in terms of a country's economy and in terms of its growth. People constantly will talk about whether, you know, trade policy, they'll talk about artificial intelligence and all of this. But what people don't talk about very often, but which is absolutely crucial, is demographics. I mean, if you take a look at Japan as an example, Japan was simply the fastest growing economy in the world until over time, its population became one of the oldest in the world. And then we saw the great slowdown in the Japanese economy over the course of the last 15 or 20 years. Well, in my opening remarks, I talked about the fact that for the first time in Canada's history, there are now more people over the age of 65. I probably look over the age of 65 in this camera. I am substantially, and than there are under the age of 15. The fastest growing segment, as we all know and we all talk about it, is in fact that of that section under the age of 15 are in fact Indigenous Canadians. And so let me just give you, you know, one. We all know the statistic that it's a heck of a lot cheaper to send people to school than to put them in jail later on. But there's an even more interesting statistic that came out in a paper done by Don Drummond, who was a senior official when I was in finance. He came out with it about a month ago. The fact is that the Indigenous population in this country is about 4% of the nation. So 4% of the nation is important, but 4% of the nation isn't going to determine the future of your economy. But the fact is that with this aging population, which we all understand, and with the fact that Indigenous people are the youngest and the fastest growing segments of our population, they have calculated that within the next 20 to 25 years, if Indigenous people are given the same quality of education that other Canadians are given, they will represent 20% of the Canadian workforce. They will represent the majority of the workforce in Saskatchewan and in Manitoba. Now you tell me, if people understood that 20% of our workforce was in jeopardy of not because they were not giving them a decent education, we weren't giving them decent health care, Canadians would not stand for that. And so this question of cost is whose cost are you asking? If we do not provide the kinds of help that you're talking about and saying that we should be partnering with other people, which we should, my generation will be fine. Somebody's going to pay my old age pension. But what we will have done to our grandchildren will be criminal. And I believe very strongly that we've got to look at the demographics and we've got to understand what it means that Indigenous Canadians are the youngest and the fastest growing segment of our population. And I think if Canadians understood it, this would be a very different debate.
Roberta Jamison.
Well, I would agree with This is why at the opening I talked about 1/5 of the labor force will be Indigenous people. That's from Don Drummond's report, and I commend it to all of you as Paul Martin has. There are many things that every Canadian can do and should do to change this picture. If the answer to the question is, do we want sustainable Indigenous communities with healthy Indigenous people? I hope and I believe the answer is yes, but we need to understand what it means. In K-12, it means teaching our children the history of the country. And I can tell you that the work that Indspire that I'm doing, we are giving educators the curriculum and the tools to do it. It means supporting young people to feel they are worthy and validated. It means in post-secondary, making sure every child graduates. If only 4 out of 10 of our kids gets out of high school, it should be a no-brainer that the country should be willing to support them through bursaries to successfully get out of post-secondary. They are the change agents that will work in their communities and will work along with other Canadians to change the country. Post-secondary, an area we know what has to be done. There's not enough gas in the tank. In universities themselves, University of Winnipeg's done something wonderful. They require every student to have a course in Indigenous relations or you don't graduate. So universities and colleges, there's a role. And frankly, universities and colleges have reaped great benefits from the colonialism that has happened in the country. Indeed, some of our trust funds from First Nations have propped up post-secondary institutions so that they could survive. We don't know this part of our history. It is there. There are many charities, which is the sector I work in, that can and should be working with Indigenous communities. But here's the caveat. In every philanthropic undertaking, in every government program, in anybody's idea of how to fix this or help, the sentiment is welcome. The approach is critical. We can no longer have an approach of designing a plan somewhere in somebody's office in downtown Ottawa or Victoria or Queen's Park, and then out it goes to the hinterland, fully resourced to support Indigenous people to solve the problem. This has been a flop for 150 years. What we now have come to understand is the driver in the change has to be Indigenous people themselves. This is why I say to anyone who is in the field or wants to get into the field, find connection with communities and leaders who will work with you. It's only if we shape and embrace our own change, take responsibility for it, are accountable for it, that it will succeed. And it will. It's hard. It takes longer. It's worth the investment because it will last, it will stick. Now, last year we were able to support 409 business students, over 450 educators, 350 nurses, 150 doctors. There are these young Indigenous people who are clamoring to come to the fore with support. So Canadians should be writing those checks. Canadians should be looking for ways to support. But don't forget, ask the questions. Who's leading this initiative? Who's validating this? Who's measuring it? Is it having an impact? Is it succeeding? I could go on, Anne-Marie. I've got a long list of things people can do. But one last thing I'll leave you with is start a conversation every day at the bus stop, in your church, at your parent-teacher night. Ask your children, grandchildren, what they learned today about Indigenous people. Ask the hard, uncomfortable questions. Challenge the people who are saying, gee, those Indians, I don't know, they live in these remote areas. How are they ever going to make a go of it? They're on a postage stamp-sized land. Man, they should just come to the city. You know, I've been hearing that my whole life. Guess what? First Nations aren't leaving their communities. First lesson. And they won't. Why? There's a sacred connection there. Number two, why are our communities living on postage-sized pieces of land? Because they've been dispossessed of natural resources. Do you think we could talk about growing an economy? Do you think we could talk about asset mapping? Do you think we could talk about things where the solutions are grown in partnership with those very communities? Because I say again, and I'll end on this, it's a win-win-win. It's a win economically. It's the right thing to do. The Supreme Court keeps telling us. Let me tell you, I work with many corporate CEOs across the country. I am privileged to channel their funds to the service of our students. They get it, believe me. But finally, it's in all of our interest. Don't you think we'd like to benefit from learning more about global environmental stewardship? Don't you think we'd like to learn more about traditional methods of healing? These are riches that are right down the street, and they're ours to be had if we open the space for Indigenous people to be Indigenous people. They don't want to be anything else. Our students tell us this at Indspire. What's the key to your success? I know who I am. I am proud of who I am. I have a strong sense of identity, and I want to give back to my community and to society at large. That's the spirit we can all identify with, and we should be nurturing together. Those are my thoughts.
I want to ask you to think about changing demographics in a changing world. In the past few years, we have seen the migration, the flight, really, of hundreds of thousands of people, really millions of people, undeterred by the protocol of borders or the perils of the voyage, because staying put and accepting the status quo is quite literally a deadly consequence. Right now, that's due to war, repressive government, economic hardship. Soon it will also be due to the consequences of climate change. How should we be thinking about borders, security, government autonomy, food security, resources, in the context of a world where desperation is the driving motivation? Wow. I know, it's a little question.
Embrace.
But you guys are up for it. Who wants to start?
Embrace traditional knowledge, Indigenous knowledge.
True.
You know, that's as simple as that. You know, to respect the land and the water. Like our Indigenous elders, our people have been living off the land and water for thousands upon thousands of years. And even in the sense of, you know, like in certain countries, like even in Canada, if we start talking about climate change and everything else that are happening, like it's even, like if the land and the water go to heck, there's nothing left. And so you have to preserve that. And it's like they're living entities, you know? So there's one country, I think it was New Zealand or Australia, that recognized the streams and water as living entities with rights. That can happen in Canada. Like that's where life comes from. They're living entities, they're breathing entities, and they should have rights and they should be recognized as such. So incorporating Indigenous knowledge again, you know, and having that respected and reflected globally is one way of doing that. You know, when you talk about people coming to Canada, all the immigrants coming to Canada, right? There's 300,000, might be going up, you know, and you have a skilled labor shortage in Canada. You know, you have an aging workforce in Canada. So I would say we need both. You have to invest in young First Nations men and women, you know, invest in human capital. You're going to have huge returns on investment in the future, no question. education and training, skills development, all of that. And then, yeah, like people ask, immigrants coming in, you know, there's a skilled labor shortage. So you need both if you're going to grow Canada's economy. And then there's this interesting thing. When these immigrants come to Canada, and we met with the immigration minister, or the person coming in, when these people come in, there's going to be a new citizenship guide, right? It's being rewritten so that when they come into Canada, they've got to respect Canada's laws. They got to respect the treaties with Indigenous peoples and acknowledge that. And I also threw in a couple of things. You should have a male elder and a female elder there. You should have a smudging ceremony. You should have a drum song and welcome them to Turtle Island. You know, all these people coming in. So that's really embracing, you know, Indigenous people's identity. That's reconciliation, when the First Nations people can welcome again everybody else coming to Canada, because we're here, right? And so that's part of that. So in this global change, and I just wanted to make a comment earlier on as well about the private sector, you know, in terms of businesses. And I've said this before at certain places, because you always hear this at different, and I spoke at the Vancouver Board of Trade, and I speak at different chambers of commerce, and they say, oh, we hired Indians once, it didn't work. I said, you should have a program called Try It Twice. And make sure you have a good recruitment and retention strategy to support First Nations people that are coming into your employment, because that's so important. And then I've also told provincial governments this, and this is a key one, because they issue licenses and permits to industry and to operate in provincial territories, right? And I said, before you issue them any kind of license or permit, that company better demonstrate that they've got a First Nations relationship engagement strategy for procurement, for a representative workforce, even for resource revenue sharing. And if that company doesn't, don't give them a license or permit. You will see key strategies, partnerships knocking on First Nations doors.
Let me get Kim Campbell's view on that, on this.
Well, I'm great, you know, I'm quite respectful of Indigenous knowledge in these areas, but if you're talking about the problems of migration as a result of climate change, I'd like people to embrace the science of climate change. Mm-hmm. I mean, it is absolutely bizarre that the denial of it. There are lots of interesting things that are on the edges. In fact, if anything, the scientists have understated the problem. They've been so harassed by people saying that they had some kind of plot or hoax scheme, that in fact we now know that things are more dangerous. And when it comes to migration, yes, Canada has benefited enormously from immigration, but the vast majority of migrants want to go back to their homes. And you see this in areas like Bangladesh, for example, when there are floods, and people are going back even before it's basically safe because they want to make sure they have their land. But those low-lying agricultural areas are being destroyed because of the salinization of their water tables. Climate change is happening. It's not something in the future, it's happening now. And if we deny the science of it and we don't tackle it, aside from the fact that we will totally discredit the capacity of democratic governments in future generations, and we shouldn't be surprised if they all run around looking for Putins to, kleptocratic Putins to run them because they don't believe in democratic government. But it also means that the movements of people will be movements that will, yes, there will be conflicts, yes, there will be natural disasters sometimes, but there won't be the kind of scale that's going to be created that will also disrupt the societies that normally would receive these populations. I mean, there has to be a kind of a management about it. I haven't read Doug Saunders' book, Maximum Canada. I've bought it. I haven't had a chance to read it. He argues that Canadian population is way too small and that we suffer from that. So we should probably, on his view, welcome more people. But I think it's a combination of things. But I think that we have to understand that we can make the movement of people worse by putting our heads in the sand and allowing disasters that disrupt populations to happen. Or we can understand that there will always be movements of people, and as a resulting of social changes and conflict, et cetera, and just desire of people to come to different places, that will benefit Canada. But again, we should also, as we've already heard, not disadvantage the young populations in our existing communities who are just waiting for the education and the opportunity to build our society.
Paul Martin, what are your thoughts on this? We are seeing the start of, you can look at Kiribati, it's starting to disappear. They're thinking of floating islands. The first floating islands are actually being prototyped right now in the South Pacific. It is a reality that coastal some coastal lands will disappear. It is a reality that Canada is a very large country with a lot of resources compared to the countries that others are fleeing. And so how does Canada move forward? Again, let's think like well beyond our next, even our next 10 or 20 years. How do we lay the groundwork for thinking about these wider issues?
Well, the answer is obviously we've got to make sure that our own house is in order, and it's obviously this is going to be the role not simply of governments but of all Canadians. I must say though that if I'm really going to embrace your question, then we've got to essentially get outside of our borders to understand where the problems are going to lie. We have, our oceans are dying. We have 3 oceans. We can do an enormous amount, but if the rest of the world simply continues to pollute the oceans the way that is happening, then our oceans on our shores are going to die. And there's going to be heavy floods coming in, which we all know what's going to happen. My own view is that Canada has a very important role to play internationally. And the door is very quickly opening for us. If I could just give you one example, if what you're really worried about, can you put that on mute? If what we're really worried about is whether it's climate change affecting the rest of the world, whether we're talking about massive floods of refugees going anywhere, I think we've got to understand that we have to play, that globalization has to work, and that Canada has to play a very vibrant role in making it happen. Let me just give you one example of the kinds of issues that we're talking about, where I think Canada has to play a larger role. And we talk about the increase in population within Canada. Within about 35 years, 1/4 of all the people in the world are going to live in Africa. At the present time, and the effect of climate change on Africa, especially in parts of Africa, we've seen it with Ethiopia as an example, or those areas are simply staggering. And Africa at the present time does not have the capacity to deal with its own internal problems. I mean, they can grow food in the south, but they can't get it up to the north because there just simply isn't the route structure or the transportation structure to do it. But the area that is really frightening, and the reason that I think that this is obviously much more than a Canadian problem, but part of the solution has got to be a very aggressive Canadian government, is that for the last 10 years, in Africa, there have been about 10 million more young people added to the population of the continent. So you've got 10 million young people every year entering the workforce. And that is projected to continue, except to grow every year for the next 20. At the same time, Africa is creating about 3 million new jobs a year. So I simply ask you to make the calculation. Somewhere between 7 to 8 million people, young people in Africa, are not getting employment. If you want to know why you've got refugees, you've got to know why you're getting these floods going into Europe. There lies your answer. And if you want to know what is a problem, think about what is going to happen if this continues for another 10 to 20 years. That population, half of them young men. That is the kind of issue that I believe in the answer to your question, whether it's climate change or whether it's how we're going to keep the peace, where I think Canada can play a tremendous role. Just despite what's happening within the G20, despite what's happening with Donald Trump, I think that there is a huge opportunity for ourselves and some of the other countries. China can play a role, but so can Canada.
Roberta Jamieson, do you want to weigh in on this one?
I would certainly support what has just been said on the leadership role that Canada can play. First, I think we need to walk our talk and be a role model. I think we need to have a way of annually giving ourselves a reality check. And I think we need to challenge ourselves to live up to our values as a country. Secondly, I place a lot of value in international instruments of whether it's the UN or the UN Declaration on Human Rights or the courts, tribunals. I think we've got to work extremely hard to strengthen these bodies. And I think we've got to isolate those who will not play. And I think this is the role of Canada. I think we're excellent ambassadors and mediators. And here again, I think there's a role for Indigenous methods. I think we also have to look internationally to see that a lot of what is happening has to do with, again, dispossession of Indigenous populations. These are not, look underneath the headline stories to see why people are being pushed, moved around, fleeing. It's, in a lot of cases, the power structures will not accommodate those who are claiming rightful rights and access to resources. So I think there are many layers, but leadership, I think, is something we can and should do. The other thing is let's not kid ourselves. The world is changing. The globe is changing. The power structures are changing. The corporations in the world are incredibly powerful. They can country shop. So we need to have a reality check as well on the limits of the power of any one particular country and realize it's a much bigger globe and it's a much bigger canvas. And we're smart enough to play on that canvas, I think.
Okay. Thank you, panelists. This is incredible. If nothing else, it certainly demonstrates that we're here for a discussion that is engaging and is important. We're not going to finish any of our discussions tonight. In fact, that's not the purpose. This is the beginning of our discussion. And over the next 3 days, the next 2 days actually after today, we'll have an opportunity to continue this debate, these discussions, and think about the very important issues facing us all. So once again, please join me in thanking our panelists and our incredible moderator.